Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Yejia, and here we do a lot of free crochet tutorials. We sometimes do styling, we sometimes talk about K-pop, but today I'm going to show you guys how to create this very beginner-friendly shrug slash bolero. I don't really know what the proper name for it is, but it's made in one rectangular panel, and then you add some like cuff detail here. As you can see, I still haven't woven in my ends yet, so don't look at that. Make sure to like this video, comment any questions that you might have, and subscribe. But yeah, let's get into the tutorial. This shrug slash bolero is made using one large rectangular panel, and so once I teach you like the stitches, like once I get you going on it, it's essentially going to be you doing a lot of the same rows of stitches. But the most important thing to start off with is understanding our measurements and therefore our calculations in order to know how big of a rectangular panel you're going to need. When we're talking about creating sleeves, we're going to be dealing with our wingspan, and give or take, your wingspan should be roughly around your height. If you have really long arms, obviously add a couple inches. If you have really short arms, you can decrease by a few inches. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is create a tension swatch using your yarn, your hook, in the stitch that I'm going to show you. To create a tension swatch, most people recommend to create like a 4x4 inch square. Honestly, I get lazy, and so I just work up like a few stitches and a few rows and I call it good. And I just generally try to get an idea of how many stitches and how many rows per inch of work. So for myself, my tension is about 7 stitches per 2 inches. With that being said, let me kind of go through the math with you guys. So to do the calculations, you're going to need to know your height slash your wingspan. For myself, I'm about 5'4", 5'5". I just said I'm 65 inches. And I subtracted 10 inches from that total measurement because I'm going to make sure that I'm allocating 5 inches per sleeve for the ribbed cuff detail. So in total, that's 10 inches. So essentially, I'm trying to get 55 inches in length for the actual shrug itself, or the rectangular panel. So to do my math, I set it up as a ratio where I have X number of stitches per 55 inches, and I'm trying to find X in order to know how many stitches I'm going to start my shrug off with. And then I know that with my tension swatch or my gauge swatch that I have about 7 stitches per 2 inches. And then you are going to cross multiply. So we have 2 inches times X. 7 times 55 is 385. And then if you're ever interested in going into engineering, I highly recommend that you always keep your units. Actually, in math in general, I always recommend that you keep your units so that you don't confuse yourself with what your final answer is. And from here, we're trying to find X. So we're gonna divide our entire equation. So X is equivalent to about 192 stitches, I believe. For myself, like I don't know why, but I feel like they're like pretty like rounded numbers. And like for 192, I'll just go 190 stitches. So I'm gonna start off with 190 stitches. But again, you can estimate this differently. Like if you know you tend to have a longer wingspan, then you can go a couple more stitches to your original calculations. You know, this isn't like a really like steadfast, like hard number. It's just the good approximation at which like your rectangular panel should be measuring out. This means I am going to have a lot of chains to start off with. So for this project, I am using a DK or number 3 weight yarn. If you know anything about yarn weights and their corresponding hook sizes, you'll know that the 6mm hook size is a bit bigger than what is usually recommended for a DK. And it's because for this stitch in particular, it's a very dense stitch. I get a lot of people asking me how I get a lot of my wearables to be so flowy and less stiff, because crocheting does tend to produce more stiff clothing. And my secret essentially is that I will use a much bigger hook than what is recommended, but I'll use a very dense stitch. So this stitch, for instance, is a knit lookalike ribbed stitch, but it's very dense, and so you can really get away with using a much larger hook size, and it has a lot more drape to it in general. So to start off, we are going to create our slip knot, and to create our slip knot, we are going to loop around our 2 fingers, twist, and then you're going to pull up your working yarn, and then go ahead and slide that onto your hook. So we just did our calculations, so you should know what number of stitches that you need to start off with. For myself, I am going to start off with 190 stitches, which means that I'm going to start off with a chain of 192. The last 2 are going to be my turning chains, and you do not work your turning chains. So if your number turns out to be like 170, then you're gonna want to start off with a chain of 172 because those last 2 are your turning chains. In order to create said chains, we are going to yarn over on our hook and then pull up. So you've just created 1 chain. And you're just going to repeat this process until you have your desired number of stitches. So this is what your chains should start looking like, and I will meet you back when I am at 192. So I've completed my 192 chains. As you can see, it's a very long chain. Now, if the idea of like chaining this much really intimidates you, you can also start off with like a foundation half double crochet stitch. I just personally never really like starting off with foundation half double crochet stitches when creating clothing because I find that it makes the seaming process at the very end a little funky. Like the seam doesn't look as clean whenever I do a foundation half double crochet stitch. But honestly, it won't make that big of a difference. So if you're like really struggling with all the chains and like keeping count of that, then I would definitely recommend just starting off with a foundation half double crochet stitch. But anyways, we now have our 192 chains, and we are going to skip those first 2 chains from our hook, and we're going to go into the 3rd chain from our hook. For myself, I am going to be working into the backs of our chains just because when you do work into the backs of the chains for this first row, it does create a much easier like braid or seam for seaming purposes later. So here also, you are going to have a couple of choices in the way that you can create this project. If you are a beginner and you struggle with tension issues, I would just recommend to use half double crochet stitch. So working into the back, to do a half double crochet, you're gonna yarn over once on your hook, just like so. And then I'm gonna work into the backs of my chain. So going into the 3rd chain from my hook, I'm gonna go into the back loop right here. And then you're gonna yarn over and pull up, yarn over once more, and pull through all 3 loops on your hook. And then again, you're gonna go into the next back loop here and complete your half double crochet. So you're just going to continue creating half double crochets for the rest of the row, and I would recommend into the backs of our chains. Personally, I am going to do yarn over slip stitch. I know that several people have told me that yarn over slip stitch can be really difficult for them, particularly as a beginner, so I just want to give you some options and tell you that you can definitely do this using half double crochet stitches. But for myself, I'm gonna do a yarn over slip stitch just because I prefer the look of that ribbing. But also by doing yarn over slip stitches, it's gonna take you a little bit more time because the stitch will build up a little bit slower than half double crochet stitches. Half double crochet stitches are a bit taller than yarn over slip stitches, so you're gonna need fewer rows of half double crochet than with yarn over slip stitch. I just personally prefer the look of yarn over slip stitches. But if you also want to do yarn over slip stitches and you want to work on your tension, then you are also going to go into that 3rd chain, into that back loop from your hook, and you're going to start off kind of like a half double crochet, honestly, where you're going to start off with a yarn over, insert your hook into the chain, yarn over once more, and then you're going to pull that up and pull it through the 2 loops you already have on your hook. So again, I started off with my yarn over, insert my hook, yarn over once more, and then slip that through the 2 loops on your hook. This is what your row should start looking like, and I am just going to continue creating all of my yarn over slip stitches for the rest of the row. And if you're doing half double crochet stitches, just continue your half double crochet stitches until you get back to your very first chain. So now I have done my yarn over slip stitches through the backs of all of my chains, and I am going to create 2 turning chains. So 1, 2, and then I'm going to turn my work. And from here, you are going to repeat this specific row over and over and over and over again until you have a panel that is to like the width that you want it. And the specific stitch that we're going to be using is, you can continue either using a half double crochet stitch, or like me, if you're using a yarn over slip stitch. Either way, I would place your hook in the 3rd loop, which is this front loop up here, and then complete your stitch as such. So again, whether you're doing half double crochet or yarn over slip stitch like me, I'm going to go into the 3rd loop only and then complete my stitch. And by going into the 3rd loop only, what you should be seeing is that you're forcing the sort of braiding or ribbing to the opposite side. And so I am going to continue creating just rows and rows and rows of the yarn over slip stitch through the 3rd loop only. And if you are doing half double crochet through the 3rd loop only. And you can start seeing the braiding detail popping out. You are just going to continue creating rows and rows and rows, working through the 3rd loop only of either yarn over slip stitch or half double crochets. And for myself personally, I am going to go ahead and work just about 55 rows of this. And then I will meet you up once I am done creating a rectangular panel of 55 rows. So as you can see, I have made some progress on my rows, and I have to now attach another yarn ball. I've seen this question quite a few times, and so I thought I would address it. Particularly with this project, you're probably gonna need to be joining a lot of different yarns together, unless you have like a really nice bulk yarn. So I'm going to show you my favorite method of joining a new yarn ball, and to do so you just need a few inches left of like the yarn that you're running out of, and then you need to take your end of your new yarn ball, and then I start that off like I cross it just like so. It's crossed, and then the strand that's underneath, I'll take that and I'll wrap it around the yarn that's over, and then back under. And then similarly, this other end, I'm going to wrap it around this other yarn. And then I take my 2 ends and I tighten them. So now you have a very nice tight knot. And then as you work your stitches, I'm going to work up to those ends. So once you reach where your ends are, I kind of place them sort of on top of my stitches in order to crochet around those ends, therefore weaving them in as I go. All right, so I weaved in, or I crocheted in those ends, and then honestly I feel like it's pretty seamless. You can't see it anymore. Everything is secured. You have now started your new little yarn ball. Hello, I have completed 55 rows of yarn over slip stitch through the 3rd loop. And as for how to measure how many rows you're gonna need, I would firstly recommend, if you want to do the same exact ribbing on the cuffs as I'm gonna show you, it's attached in multiples of 5, and so I would recommend working up your rectangular panel in rows of 5 or like multiples of 5. In order to know how many rows that you're going to need to work, you are going to need to wrap it around yourself and then wrap it around your arm. And for myself, obviously like don't wear a thick sweater like I am right now. For myself, what I aimed to get in terms of measurement is that I wanted it to sit comfortably around my upper arm, which is like the thickest part of my arm, and I wanted it to be so that it's not stretched over my arm whatsoever. It's just like able to connect comfortably, and then that way, because this is the thickest part of my arm, on the thinner part of my arm where we're going to create that ribbed cuff sleeve, you are going to have a much bigger space. As you can see, like it's quite loose, and you're going to tighten it up using the ribbing for the cuff portion. Okay, so my panel in like length, like total length, is measuring out to be just about 55 inches, and then in terms of width, we are looking at just under 11 inches. So at this point, once you have your rectangular panel that fits you and your measurements, I am going to wrap it around myself like a little shawl, and I would have some stitch markers on hand, and you're going to mark out approximately where sort of like it needs to start connecting at your armpit area in order to create the sleeve. Now, a couple of things for like measurements and calculations in terms of the sleeves. So the first thing that I would do is approximate, you know, where your sleeves are going to start on either side, and then I would count the number of stitches that you're going to need in that middle area to cover your back, but then like, you know, like this is like the part where you're going to connect. So I would measure, or I would count out approximately how many stitches in the middle you're going to not connect, to leave like the opening for your back. For myself personally, I am going to leave 70 stitches in the middle for like the opening of it, and then per sleeve I'm going to be working 60 stitches. So for myself, that's 190. So in order to do the math, you're going to want to measure out approximately, you know, how many stitches you're going to need, and then you are going to subtract that number from your total number of stitches, and then whatever number you have left, divide that by 2, because you need per sleeve, right? So like once I measured it out, for instance, I had 190 stitches to begin with, and then it's going to be a 70 stitch back opening. 190 minus 70 is 120. 120 divided by 2 is 60 per sleeve. So that's how you know how many stitches per sleeve you're going to need to connect. Okay, so hopefully that calculation slash measurements explanation made a bit of sense to you guys. And at this point, I am going to start connecting the long sides together in order to create my sleeves. In terms of like order of operations, we're going to connect for our sleeves first, and then we are going to create the ribbing for the cuffs. Now, like I said, with the measurement slash calculation explanation, I am going to be connecting 60 stitches per sleeve. However, one thing that I realized after making the first version of the shrug is that when you have like a rectangular panel, like your body's not a rectangle, so you need to like kind of adjust for that. What I mean by that is that the part that's like on your back, on the bottom part of your back, that part is going to be really baggy if you don't like take into consideration that you're going to need to make a couple of decreases when you are connecting things. For the first 55 stitches, I'm just going to utilize a slip stitch seam, and for the last 5 stitches, I'm going to connect 2 stitches per one of those stitches. This is going to make a lot more sense as I show you, I promise, but I've finished my last row, and I'm going to give myself chain 1, kind of turn my work. And the way that I am going to connect everything, I am going to go through the 3rd loop just like we've been doing, and I am going to insert my hook into the first stitch, like the entire stitch. And as you can see, when you work into the backs of your chains on your like initial row, you are left with this really nice braiding, and this is what I meant by it makes for a really easy seaming. So I'm gonna go ahead and make a slip stitch seam. And to do that, you're just gonna yarn over and then bring that yarn over up through everything. And again, I'm gonna go through my next third loop only, inserting my hook into the actual stitch, yarning over, and then completing my slip stitch seam. And then I'm just going to continue this process until I have the first 55 out of the 60 stitches that I'm going to use to connect my sleeve completed. And then I'll see you back for the last 5 stitches. Okay, so I have now connected the first 55 stitches of my sleeve, and I'm going to go into the third loop only, just like we've been doing. And this is what I mean by I'm going to be connecting 2 stitches per 1 stitch for the last 5 stitches. To do so, I'm going to again insert my hook into the third loop only, and then I'm going to insert my hook into the first actual stitch that it corresponds to. I'm going to yarn over and pull up, and then I'm going to insert my hook into the next stitch, yarn over and pull up, and that yarn over you are going to pull through everything. So you've now connected 1 stitch to 2 stitches on this side. So that's 1, this is number 2. So again, I'm going to go into the next stitch, yarning over and pulling up, next stitch, inserting my hook, yarning over and pulling up, and then I'm going to pull that yarn over through everything. And essentially what this is doing is making sure that this back portion is going to be a little bit tighter against your body instead of flapping all about. And from here, I am just going to slip stitch into the third loop for the next 70 stitches, because remember the 70 stitches is for my back, or the opening of the actual shrug, and 70 stitches is what I determined is going to measure for my back and my measurements. We are not connecting the 2 sides of the panel in doing so. We are just slip stitching, and I would also just go through the third loop just for continuity purposes, but yeah, we're just slip stitching just to get the yarn to the other side, basically. So I'm gonna go ahead and slip stitch through the third loop only for the next 70 stitches, and then I'll be back to show you once more how I'm sort of connecting 2 stitches to 1. So as you can see, I have marked out with a bobby pin or a stitch marker, or whatever you want to use, where I'm going to start connecting for those first 5 stitches, because it's not just 60, right? It's 55 plus the 2 per stitch that we're going to connect on the back here. And so if you are following my stitch count or my measurements, for instance, you would put your stitch marker at the 65th stitch on this side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and insert my hook into the third loop only here, and then I'm going to go ahead into where my bobby pin is, and then go ahead and yarn over, pull up, insert your hook into the next stitch, yarn over, and then pull all the way through all your stitches, or all your loops. So that was 1, that is 5. Okay, so now I'm just going to use a regular slip stitch seam to connect these 2 sides as well. Also, at this point, I would highly recommend that you try this on for size. If you're finding that you're having still an extra gapping in the back, in the back of your armpits, I suppose, then you can undo the seaming here. And then what I would recommend is to either increase the number of stitches that you are connecting per stitch on the front side, or you can vary the number of stitches that you're doubling up stitches. So for instance, I did my last and first 5 stitches where I did a 1-to-2 ratio. you can increase or decrease this. So you can do like 10 stitches instead, where you are doing that 1:2 ratio of stitches. But either way, I would highly recommend that you are trying this on for size at this point and making sure that these measurements make sense for you and adjusting it according to your needs. Okay, so at this point I am all connected, I'm all seamed up, and what we are going to do is actually turn our sleeves inside out, because that seam that you just created is quite obvious, whereas if you flip it, and make sure that when you're flipping it, you're flipping your yarn with you, like your actual yarn ball. So like I just grab go through the sleeve, grab my yarn, and then you flip. So then your yarn's not tangled up, but you've successfully flipped your sleeve. And if you notice the seam here, this is where our seam is. But I think it's pretty seamless. And so that's why I flipped it. Now we are gonna start working on that really cool ribbed cuff sleeve. And to do so, I'm actually going to switch over to a much smaller hook. That is my secret. I am using a 3.5mm hook. As you tug on the loop, you will see that one side is like actually shortening, right? So the orientation in which you want to place your hook back onto the loop is so that the side that's like tightening is in the front. And that's how you're going to get the correct orientation. Now at this point, we are going to chain the length that you want your ribbed cuff sleeve to be. So for myself, I'm going to start off by chaining 30 plus 2 turning chains, and that for me is about 5 inches in length, which is like why in the very beginning when we were doing our calculations, I subtracted 10 from my wingspan / height measurement, because I was accommodating for the ribbing on the cuff here. So, all right, that's 30, and then I'm going to go ahead and give myself 2 additional turning chains. And at this point, I'm going to skip those first 2 chains, going into the 3rd chain through the back of our chain. I'm going to insert my hook into that back of our chain, and I'm going to start off with a row of half double crochets. So if you've already made your panel in half double crochets, you already should know how to do this, but essentially you yarn over, you insert your hook into the stitch, yarn over once more and pull up, yarn over once more, and then pull through all 3. So I'm just going to continue creating half double crochets for the entire row. Okay, so I've completed my first row, which is just half double crochets, 30 of them to be exact. And at this point, I'm going to start connecting the ribbed cuff to the rest of my sleeve. And the way that I'm going to do that, essentially the way that I sort of read my stitches or my rows, and where to insert my hook is that this is row 1, row 2 is in the back here, it's in that middle portion, and then row 3, row 4, row 5, so on and so forth. Right? So when you are working a row of half double crochets and you are connecting back to your sleeve, at that point I would use 3 slip stitches to connect. So what I mean by that is that I'm going to go into sort of the top portion here of my first row that I see. And another one of my tips always, when I am like connecting panels or like connecting and doing seaming type of things, I always try to go underneath 2 strands of yarn, because I find that if you only go through 1, you're gonna have a really obvious gap. So I also make sure that my tension is fairly tight at this point. So I'm gonna make 1 slip stitch. And then now we're looking into this row, which is our row 2, right? And the way that I'm going to connect it is that I'm going to go underneath this strand here, as well as this strand, and then slip stitch it together. And then the next one, you kind of just go on the top of this 3rd row. So I'm going into the top there and slip stitching my work. And as you can see, that's creating for less gapping where you are seaming. So here I'm gonna kind of turn my work a bit and skipping those first 3 stitches because those were used to seam our cuff to the rest of our sleeve. So I'm skipping 1, 2, 3, and then I'm gonna go into the backs of my stitches in order to create a row of slip stitches. So I'm now creating a row of slip stitches through the back of my chain or stitch. Okay, so I've just completed my last slip stitch through the back loop, and I'm going to give myself chain 1, sort of turn my work again, and then yet again you are going to do another row of slip stitches through the backs of your stitches. Once you're done with your last stitch, we are going to now seam 2 slip stitches onto the rest of our sleeve. So to do that, again, we're looking at, a row that's on the back technically. And so this is our right part of our stitch, and this is the left part. So I'm gonna go through the left, kind of hold that in place while I insert my hook through the right side, yarn over and complete that slip stitch. And then again into the top of our next row. And that's just 2 slip stitches. So kind of turn my work, and then skipping those first 2, we're going to go into the third and into the back, and do yet again another row of slip stitches through the back loop only. So go ahead and finish out your row with the stitch. And once you've completed the last stitch here, once you've completed that last stitch, this is at the point in which the rows are going to start repeating. So to start off, we're going to do yet again another row of half double crochets, but in order to start that off, we're going to chain 2 as our turning chains, turn our work, and we are going to work into the backs of our stitches. So skipping those first 2 chains, going into the backs of our stitches, we're going to create a row of half double crochets. Okay, so I've completed my row of half double crochets, and it is now time to connect once more. So again, when you do your row of half double crochets, you're going to connect in multiples of 3. So 1, 2, and then 3, and then you're going to turn your work, and then you're going to work essentially 3 rows of slip stitches, and then when you're working a slip stitch back up, you are going to connect with 2 slip stitches. So you're just going to repeat this sequence of rows until you have come back all the way around, and then I'll show you how to seam the sides of your cuff together. I have finished about 11 of the ribbing, and like the way that I'm counting it is that like each 2x2 ribbing, so like these 2 braiding details, that's 1 ribbing. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I have currently 11, and now I am ready to seam the sides of the cuff together. However, to connect the 2 sides of the panel, I am also just going to use slip stitches. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the sleeve inside out once more. And again, I'm putting my arm through my sleeve. Oh, she's looking so pretty. And I'm going to grab the rest of my yarn as well. And then we're going to flip all together in order to prevent like any tangling or weird issues with our yarn. Okay, so in order to connect these 2 sides of this panel, we are going to first, so when I worked the last stitch, I didn't make any turning chains. Right now, I am going to create 1 turning chain just so that is ready to go. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to insert my hook into this very first stitch on the first row of the panel that we have worked on. And then I'm going to go ahead and slide my hook onto the working yarn loop, making sure that my orientation is correct, meaning that the side of the yarn that's tightening should be the side that's closest to me, or the side that I can see right here. Okay, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and insert my hook into the very first stitch, but I'm gonna only go through the backs of my stitch for continuity purposes, since all of our stitches worked for the cuff has been through the back loop. So from here, I'm going to yarn over, and then I'm going to pull through everything that I have on my hook. Great. So now I'm going to go ahead and into my second stitch, and I'm going to go into the second stitch but the back loop only, and go ahead and slip stitch seam this all together. And then once you are done with your last stitch, you can go ahead and pull out a few inches of your yarn, and then go ahead and snip that off. And then sometimes I have found, luckily I don't really see it with this sleeve, but sometimes I have found that like even after trying my best to make sure that there's no like really big obvious gaps or anything, what I like doing when I'm weaving in my ends is that I will take this end and I will sew some of those more obvious gaps shut. But I don't really see too much of an issue with this sleeve, so I'm just gonna kind of leave it be and then weave this end in pretty as I usually do. So, and there we go. We have finished our little cool little cuff detail here, and now we just need to repeat it on this other side. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and explain how to start off the ribbed cuff portion here, but you know, essentially all the steps are the same for the other cuff. I just want to show you because this one you are going to join a new ball of yarn. There's a few factors that just are a little bit different, and if you're a little bit of a beginner, I just want to kind of hold your hand, walk you through it. But anyways, we are going to start off where, you know, our little end is out here, which for me, I'm going to mark this as like the first row. So I have my new ball of yarn. I'm going to create a little slip knot. And I love this part because I hate weaving in my ends. So like the fewer ends that I have to weave in at the end of a project, the better. And this method is going to allow me to have fewer ends to weave in. So I am going to go ahead and into kind of where my end is sort of popping out here. I'm just going to kind of insert my hook into the space, and then I'm going to slip my slip knot on. I'm going to go ahead and slip that up. And now I am going to start off my chain just like the other sleeve. I'm doing 30 and then my 2 turning chains at the end, so I'm going to chain 32 in total. So I've chained my 32, and then I'm going to go ahead and start my half double crochets through the third loop, through the back of the loop, and go ahead and create half double crochets for my row. And now as I'm working up my row, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of like hold my ends taut against my sort of chain that I've got going on here, so that I know when to start incorporating it into my stitches. So it can feel a little funky and it can be a little weird, but like if you do this, you are going to weave in your ends as you go, and you're not going to have a bunch of ends to weave in later at the end of your project when you're just kind of done with it. So now that I have all that weaved in, I'm going to go ahead and start actually connecting my sleeve. And just like I said, for the half double crochets, you are going to connect with 3 slip stitches. And now we're just going to repeat all the instructions and steps that we did for that first cuff. And then once you weave in your ends, you are done. Here is the final product. I really love shrugs and boleros. I feel like they're so versatile in a wardrobe, and they just like, I don't know, they add like a little spice to your outfit. And I'm currently also working on creating a matching tube top. I've been really into matching sets lately, so I'm creating that. I originally created this bolero in a pink color because I wanted to do like a black and pink matching set, but then I was like, oh, I think that the black will be probably really difficult to see on camera for a tutorial version, which is why I made the blue version, because I feel like for the blue I'm gonna pair it with a white. But anyways, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment any questions, and subscribe. Thank you to my patrons as well, and I'll see you next time. Bye.